Hi everyone, welcome to week 2 of online learning. As you can tell, I'm home now, sheltering in place with my dogs. This is my dog Lola. She might be disrupting my videos this week. I have another dog, Reggie, somewhere around, who might make an appearance in the background too. Alright, so this video, I just want to review some deadlines and expectations with you guys. I would also like to review the patient 0 case study and this podcast will kill you thing that you did Friday. Okay. And then we're also going to go through the weekly assignments for this week, so you guys know exactly what you're supposed to be doing. All right, so let me pull the slides up. So far, you guys have been killing it this week. I really appreciate how much time you guys are putting into the assignments. I like giving you guys feedback digitally. I hope you guys are reading my comments, especially if you're missing something. I'll put that in a comment. So make sure you look those over after I submit something on Classroom. Again, make sure that you're not spending more than 40 minutes a day on this class. If it's taking you longer than 40 minutes, let me know. That means I need to change something for you guys. Don't forget my office hours are from 10 to 11. So if you have questions and you want to Zoom with me, or you just want to email me during the hour, you can email me whenever and I'll respond. That's the best time to do it. All right, so let's jump into it. Here I have some sample responses from the patient 0 case study that you guys did, and this was the assignment for Thursday of last week. So part 1, and I know this case study kind of jumped all over the place. He was talking about typhoid, and then all of a sudden I would talk about HIV. But I hope at the end of the podcast, you guys kind of pulled it all together, and I'll go over the main points at the end. So part 1, emerging diseases. So all of the possible causes of disease, we should know this. Pathogens, which are bacteria, viruses, prions, parasites, protozoa, fungi. Some diseases that are transmissible from person to person. List all the ways this might happen. So we know respiratory droplets. This can also happen skin-to-skin contact, fecal matter, bodily fluids, saliva, blood, semen. Epidemiologists can't do controlled experiments on humans, obviously, so how can they determine the cause of the disease? So you guys should have seen this in this case study, but also in the podcast for Friday. They try to locate patient 0. So they determine the origin of the genetic material of the virus or another pathogen, and then compare that genetic material of the virus to other known viruses. Part B, how can they figure out whether it's transmissible? So again, they observe ground 0. So where did the pandemic first start as an outbreak? They interview patients. They review history of similar cases. Part C, if it is transmissible, how can they determine the mode of transmission? So again, it's really important that they interview patients. They interview people who had it early on, observations of interactions in endemic sites, and then also reviewing history of similar cases. So part 2 was about spillover. So spillover is when a pathogen moves from one species to another. It's zoonotic. It can be transmitted from one species to another. So how does the molecular clock allow us to determine the approximate time of origin of a virus? So this came from the slide with the phylogenetic tree. And this is kind of my summary, what I wrote. We can determine the branch length from the common ancestor, so where all of these strains of this virus branched out from, of a pathogen, and measure the average rate of divergence. So the rate at which it broke off from the ancestor. As seen on the graph, over time the average length of divergence increased, meaning that the virus was mutating and evolving from the common ancestor of HIV. This is something that's really scary about viruses, is how quickly they can mutate. Even when the virus is in a person, it is still mutating. You guys saw that in the video about HIV. When the HIV virus enters a person, it continues to mutate inside its host. That's how quickly they mutate. Part 2, what other viral infections have you heard of that can infect other animals in addition to humans? So many. Remember the term zoonotic. These are referred to as spillover infections. So here's a list that I made. You guys might have just had a few of these. So the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, from genetic analyses, and this is still under speculation, of the virus suggests that it has origins in bats. And again, this is not known for sure. Evidence suggests that, but it's not for sure. SARS, which you guys listened to on Friday, the case study about SARS, and the case study you're going to do today, potentially from snakes, again, not sure. MERS, which is another coronavirus, is from camels, speculative. H1N1 influenza comes from birds. The bubonic plague came from ticks carried by rats. Malaria, protozoa carried by mosquitoes. Rabies, this is a fun virus, can jump from any mammal through saliva, open wounds and saliva. There's another group of viruses called hantaviruses, which jump from species to species through fecal matter and urine of rats. There's a really bizarre parasite called Toxoplasma gondii, which can infect the brains. Speculated that it currently infects the brains of about 2 billion people worldwide, and its hosts are primarily house cats, domesticated house cats. Ebola, which came from bats. Lyme disease, which can be transmitted through ticks. And then HIV, which was discussed a lot in this podcast, this case study, which comes from the blood of chimpanzees, which were hunted for food in Africa. Number 3, why do you think these viruses are so alarming to public health officials? So it can be very difficult to track down the origin of the disease. As you notice in this case study, a lot of these diseases come from exotic wild animals, and it can be tricky to regulate exposure to these animals. It can be tricky to regulate who is in contact with these animals. But then also, a lot of these diseases can jump from wildlife to domesticated animals, which many humans are around daily in the world. Part 3, why then? So how is the world changing in 1908? It didn't specifically say this in the podcast, is more of an inference. So scientists at the time were just discovering microscopic organisms like bacteria, not a lot of knowledge known about those microorganisms. So there weren't a lot of rules and regulations in place regarding sanitation, for example, washing your hands. Excuse me. Number 2, how might these conditions be relevant to the spread of an infectious disease? So without regulations on sanitation, pathogens can easily spread from host to host. Okay, and the last part, prevention. So how can non-human animals provide a pathway for new viruses to enter the population? So as stated earlier, certain strains of pathogens, especially viruses, can easily hop from one species to another, which is referred to as a spillover event. For example, avian flu can jump from birds to pigs to humans. That was in one of the videos. Much of the human population lives in close contact with either domesticated animals or wild animals, including your pets. Most of the world's populations also consume animals. So some of these viruses and lots of pathogens can be transmitted through the consumption of meat. Consider the emergence of a pandemic from the spillover event to the worldwide transmission. Where are points at which we could stop the spread of the disease, and at which point would be the easiest? So I'd hope that you would conclude from this case study, from all the evidence that you heard, that it is vital that we first determine the mode of transmission and find patient 0. Because when we find patient 0 and we know how it's transmitted, then we can start to develop a vaccination. So when we understand the origin of an emergent disease, we can fight the disease at its source and develop a vaccine. After an outbreak becomes a pandemic, it can be too late to stop the spread of the disease. So it's very important that we find the origin of the disease, find how it's transmitted, find patient 0, interview people who were in contact with the virus or pathogen, figure out how it got into the population, and then from there develop a vaccination. All right, so I just have a few closing thoughts here about this case study, because I know, especially towards the end, started to talk about stigmas and discrimination. I don't want to get too political, but I feel like it's important to mention some points here. So in summary, Typhoid Mary and experts at the time knew she was patient 0 for many of the outbreaks of typhoid in New England in 1908. She was the mode of transmission, but the lack of education about sanitation and microorganisms at the time continued the spread of this disease. It is so vital to first determine patient 0 and the mode of transmission of an infectious disease to keep an outbreak from becoming a pandemic. And then some of this ignorance is mirrored in other pandemics, especially the HIV pandemic in the 1980s. Due to lack of education and discrimination, officials did not take this epidemic seriously, leading to exponential transmissions and new cases. This is a whole can of worms I don't want to open at this point, because I don't feel like I can do it justice talking about this digitally. But if you want to talk with me about this, I'd be more than happy to. There's a really great resource that I posted right here. Talks about leftover stigma from the HIV outbreak in the 80s and how that's been ingrained in some governing policies that are still around today. And if you want to learn more about how stigma, prejudice, and discrimination lead to disease, this is a really, really good website right here. So the term patient zero, as heard in the podcast, was first coined during the HIV endemic in the 1980s. This man, his name was Gaten Dugas. He knowingly spread HIV to potentially thousands of people through sexual contact. Although his actions were unforgivable and criminal, he was not actually patient zero. So that was kind of nonsense at the time. They were focusing on him even though he wasn't patient zero. And because all of their attention was focused on Gaten, people were dying. So much attention was focused on Gaten rather than on actually finding the origin of the disease, which we now know came from human contact with chimpanzee blood in tropical regions of Africa. So in summary, in order to prevent epidemics and pandemics, you need a beginning, some way of explaining how this disaster happened and how it might happen again. We as a society have to set aside our differences in order to determine the origin of a pathogen to faster develop a vaccination and save lives. So we have to start the battle at the origin, and we have to focus on education about the disease. Put aside our differences and focus on saving lives. This is a fun picture. It says perseverance, Don't take all the people you cook for, don't take all the people you cook for get typhoid for an answer. Just a fun picture about Typhoid Mary. Also, if you're interested more about how governments respond to pandemics, there's a really great book, World War Z, written in the early 2000s, and it was made into a movie starring Brad Pitt, if you're interested in checking that out. All right, so next up, I'm going to quickly go through This Podcast Will Kill You, which you guys did Friday. So some symptoms: fever, shortness of breath, body aches, dry cough. So those are very similar to the symptoms that the novel coronavirus has. Provide evidence for the podcast that SARS and MERS, our current novel coronaviruses, are related. So they are all caused by coronaviruses, SARS, this current pandemic, and MERS. They also have very similar symptoms. It's usually an upper respiratory problems. So part 2, according to this podcast, what are coronaviruses? So they're a large group of RNA viruses that we've known about for a long time that have been transmitted from humans to animals, again, over a long period of time. Why are coronaviruses called coronaviruses? So corona means crown in Spanish. On a scanning electron microscope, these viruses have a halo of proteins that kind of look like a crown. So that's why they're coined coronaviruses. And then part 3, provide evidence from the podcast about the origins of coronaviruses. So domesticated animals and wildlife are thought to be the origin of coronaviruses. So your evidence is going to vary, but make sure that you collect your evidence and use it on the summative. I do like the quote from this podcast. I copied it here. We need to channel more money into research of wildlife conservation and into interdisciplinary collaborations. So understanding more about wildlife will help us prevent more pandemics like this one. Here's my timeline if you want to pause it now and check your timeline with my timeline. I'm not going to spend too much time going through that. And then I will read your responses to the last question when I go through your videos. Okay, so looks like this video is going to cut me off in about a minute. So I'm going to show you this one little thing I'd like you guys to do for me today. This e-learning feedback form. Just let me know what's going well so far, what is not going well so far, and how I can make it better. And let me know any other comments that you have for me at this time to make e-learning easier for you guys. So I'm going to have to do this in 2 parts. So in the next part of this video, I'm going to explain what you guys are going to do this week. I'll keep it short. And then don't forget your summative is going to be this Friday. And I will make a separate video to explain how to do that summative when I post it on Friday.